You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today we're looking at Edgar Degas. Edgar Degas was born in 1834, and he grew up in a reasonably wealthy Parisian family. His father, Augustin Degas, was a banker, while his mother, Marie-Célestine Mousson Degas, was actually from the U.S. She was born in New Orleans back around 1815. She sang opera and encouraged young Edgar to develop his talent for art. Degas received a classical education at the prestigious Lycée Louis Lamothe, where he excelled in literature. His father appreciated his talent for art, but encouraged Degas to pursue law because art was just not seen as a viable career path. Edgar actually did enroll in law school, but he quickly dropped out to pursue art full-time. He registered as a copyist at the Louvre, where he meticulously studied and replicated works by old masters. In some ways, you might say that Degas was a traditionalist. He was captivated by works of the Italian Renaissance. He copied extensively from artists like Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, appreciating their mastery of anatomy, composition, and perspective. He also admired the works of Northern Renaissance artists like Hans Holbein the Younger and Albrecht Dürer, known for their meticulous details and realism. Degas was also known to copy the works of Spanish masters like Velázquez and Goya. He was drawn to their dramatic use of light and shadow and their powerful portrayals of the human figure. The story goes that Degas actually met Manet when the two of them bumped into each other at the Louvre. Degas was working on an etching of a Velázquez piece. He was working directly on the copper plate right there in the gallery, and Manet saw that it wasn't going exceptionally well and offered the younger artist some advice. The two of them struck up a friendship and held some mutual admiration, although at times they would hurl somewhat caustic remarks at each other's works. This would not be unusual for Degas. He had a reputation for being somewhat aloof and at times a difficult person to get along with. His friendships with fellow artists appear to have been somewhat turbulent, although he was largely guarded about his private life. We know far more about his art. In 1855, he entered the École des Beaux-Arts, where he trained under Louis Lamothe, a follower of the neoclassical artist Ingres. During this period, Degas focused on traditional subjects, like historical scenes and portraits, and he was fairly successful at it. Degas would be one of the few Impressionists accepted by the Paris Salon, although not for the ballet dancers and the style of work we associate with him today. Also, while he exhibited with the Impressionists, and he was friends with Impressionists like Mary Cassatt, he didn't actually embrace that label. He considered himself a realist or an independent artist. He had a strong interest in drawing and a keen eye for observation, which would later become hallmarks of his artistic style. Of course, I feel like I can't get through an episode about a 19th century European artist without talking about Japanese prints. As Japan was forced to open up trade with the West, people were captivated by the works of artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige. Degas was among those greatly influenced by the Japanese woodblock prints, which he collected avidly. These prints introduced him to new compositional techniques and perspectives. His work, though, was less overtly copying Japanese prints compared to what we saw from many other European artists enamored with the ukiyo-e pieces. But in a print like Mary Cassatt in the Paintings Gallery at the Louvre, we see Degas embracing the asymmetrical balance as well as the tall, narrow proportions of Chu Tanzaku prints. And of course, as always, sincere apologies on any and all mispronunciations. I'm doing my best, but not a native speaker. In 1856, Degas embarked on a 3-year journey to Italy where he immersed himself in the art of the Renaissance and antiquity. He filled numerous sketchbooks with studies of classical sculptures, frescoes, and paintings. The thing is, he wasn't just making copies of great artworks. He was learning and internalizing the techniques and the principles of the old masters. He used these copies as a springboard for his own artistic explorations, ultimately developing a unique style that blended tradition and modern ideas. One of his great early oil paintings is a family portrait known as the Ballet family. This painting depicts his Aunt Laure, her husband Baron Ballet, and their two daughters, Giulia and Giovanna. The Baron, an exiled Italian patriot, and his family lived in Florence. The portrait subtly captures the underlying tensions within the family, with Laure in mourning for her recently deceased father, and the Baron appearing somewhat aloof. The girls are aged 7 and 10 at the time, and they sort of contrast each other, one playful and carefree, the other seemingly already constrained by societal expectations. This masterpiece from Degas' early career is often compared to Flemish portraits. He's employing this composition and color to convey a sense of isolation and emotional distance between the family members, hinting at their individual struggles within the confines of their circumstances. This portrayal of individual struggles confined by circumstances feels like great foreshadowing for the ballet dancer pieces that would come to be his calling card. But we'll get into that a bit later. By the 1860s, Degas had returned to Paris and was beginning to develop his own distinctive artistic voice. While his early training and travels provided a solid foundation, it was his relentless experimentation and his commitment to capturing the essence of modern life that would ultimately make him such a celebrated figure from art history. Of course, part of that success was also the circle of friends that he kept. Degas frequented the same cafes as other artists, writers, and intellectuals. It was there that he would engage in lively discussions and debates with other emerging artists like Monet, Renoir, and Pissarro, sharing their dissatisfaction with the rigid academic system. While Degas maintained a certain distance from the Impressionist label, he preferred to be considered a realist or independent, he was very much a part of that scene. Degas helped organize the independent exhibitions that became synonymous with the Impressionist movement. He participated in 7 of the 8 exhibitions held between 1874 and 1886. In 1877, Degas actually personally invited Mary Cassatt to exhibit with the Impressionists, recognizing her talent and aligning artistic sensibilities. This marked a turning point in Cassatt's career, bringing her into the fold of the Parisian avant-garde. When Degas first noticed Cassatt's work at the Paris Salon in 1874, he was immediately impressed. Actually, even before he met her, he remarked, quote, "There is someone who feels like I do," end quote. They shared an interest in capturing scenes from modern life, particularly involving women and children. Now, after a short break, I want to talk about Degas and his portrayal of women, specifically ballet dancers. In 1874, Edgar Degas' father, Augustin Degas, passed away, and shortly after, Edgar discovered that his brother René had amassed quite a bit of debt. For the first time in his life, Edgar Degas actually needed to earn money. Selling paintings was no longer just a bonus, it was a necessity to support himself and his family. Around 1870, Degas had begun painting scenes of modern leisure, the cafes, horse racing, and, obviously, ballerinas. By the time he died, he had created around 1,500 paintings, drawings, prints, and sculptures of ballerinas. One practical reason for this was simply they sold well. Of course, I think there's something more to it, a deeper reason that these works resonated and sold so well. Audiences today tend to look at these pictures as beautiful colors and works capturing the artistry of these dancers. While that's part of the appeal, it's only a part of the story. Some have pointed to the dramatic lighting and bursts of color exploding out of vast areas of tone as capturing a dynamism to the dance. It may have also been partly due to the artist's eyes. Degas suffered from progressive bilateral central vision loss and photophobia. He first mentioned his vision problems around the age of 19, actually, and by the 1870s, it was becoming pretty bad. The colors and contrasts may have been a natural result of his sensitivity to light. Certainly by the end of his career, he was making the now celebrated bronze statues because the tactile medium of sculpture was more accessible to the artist who would be nearly completely blind by the end of his life. Just take a moment to consider the difficulty and the terror of that situation. I mean, a visual artist losing his vision. Now, let's shift to another sort of terror. One thing that surprises a lot of audiences today is that ballet was a rather sordid business. Men were known to frequent the shows not simply for the artistry, but to catch a glimpse of the dancers in tutus with legs exposed in a way that would have been taboo in another context. Degas' paintings often depicted the young ballet rats, as they were called, working-class girls who aspired to become professional dancers. His works sometimes hinted at the exploitation and vulnerabilities these young women faced in the competitive world of ballet. At the theater, there was a lounge where wealthy male patrons could sit and gain access to the ballerinas. Often they would proposition the young women who felt immense pressure to say yes, because these wealthy men could support them and their families. The men also supported the venue, so management would be pushing the dancers to be friendly. In Degas' painting, The Rehearsal of the Ballet on Stage, we can actually see men off to the side of the stage sitting and watching the girls. The leer is palpable to anyone familiar with the more sordid aspects, and yet the figures are small and easily overlooked in the composition. Degas' arrangement of the picture is interesting. While so many of his peers favored painting outdoors, capturing their spontaneous response to the landscape or a fleeting moment, Degas gives us interiors and carefully choreographed figures. He also chooses a vantage point that's noticeably distant from his subject. Many of his pictures are not only distant, but also from a slightly elevated perspective, as though he's looking down on the scene, like a scientist studying their test subjects. Degas' fascination with ballet dancers likely stemmed from a complex mix of feelings. He considered himself a realist with the goal of portraying the reality rather than the idealized beauty portrayed on stage. He wanted to capture the dancers' hard work, their practice, their exhaustion, but also the social pressures and the power imbalances. Some sources have talked about his personal connection with dancers. He was granted freedom to move about backstage, watching performances as well as the rehearsals, and no doubt he got to know some of the dancers. Some speculate he had relationships with some of them, while others suggest he was simply drawn to their dedication and resilience. I also think the simplest and most obvious motivation is true. Degas was deeply interested in depicting movement and the human figure in action. Ballet dancers, with their graceful poses and dynamic movements, provided him with a perfect subject to explore these challenges. These works also provided Degas with opportunities to experiment with perspective, composition, and lighting. He used unusual angles and cropping to create dynamic and expressive compositions, often emphasizing the patterns of light and shadow on the dancers' bodies and costumes. Ultimately, I think these works have stood the test of time because we can look at them through different lenses and still find something to appreciate. Whether social commentary, a peek behind the curtain and glimpse into another person's lived experiences, or simply an aesthetic experience, reveling in the lights, the colors, the texture and flow of the costumes and graceful movements of the dancers. There's just something beautiful in the work.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.